Legislative meeting. As you know, with the special session, this is throwing us off regular schedule, but with the resolve of the state shutdown, we thought having a meeting sooner than later was more important. So we appreciate Connie and her efforts, and also those of our speakers, Tom Melcher, Lisa Larson, and Valerie Dosman, for being available today to share information with us. Just a couple of things before we start. We'd like to ask that everybody shut your phones off. Today we are going to be actually videotaping this, making this available through MASBO's website for members that weren't able to attend. So we're trying to eliminate all distractions as possible. I want to let you know restrooms are available just down the hall and off to the left, just past that cafeteria area. And then, lastly, our presenters today are Valerie Dosman and Lisa Larson and Tom Melcher. I'm going to have Valerie give us a brief update of the special session, how it unfolded, and then also to tie those things that MASBO advocated for in our platform that may or may not have been passed. And then we will be doing a policy review with Lisa Larson. And then, actually, a very, as always, detailed overview by Tom Melcher. And it will give us an opportunity to ask questions for that. So I'd like to ask Valerie to come up and address the
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. I bet you were about as relieved as I am that special session ended and that we have a resolution. First of all, really, wow, what an interesting session. They're all really interesting, but this by far, and I've been around the legislature since 1998, and this by far was the most fascinating election outcome and fascinating legislative session. There was just so many different scenarios and possibilities, and how it ultimately unfolded in the end, I personally found really fascinating. I'm going to leave it up to Tom Melcher to go into a lot of the details of what was finally agreed upon, but I'm just going to kind of give you a recap of how session started and how we ended up. First of all, there was a historic change in the legislature. First time in 40 years, the Republicans had the majority in both bodies. And there was a significant amount of new members, freshman members, in both the House and Senate. And a lot of those new members ran on a campaign of fiscal responsibility. The size of the government is too much. We're going to reduce the budget, and we're not going to raise taxes. Well, meanwhile, we had a historic recount in the governor's race. We didn't know who our governor was until just a few weeks before the start of the legislative session, which put the governor behind in their efforts to craft a budget. And we had a governor who ran on a platform of, I'm going to raise taxes. The size, we need to invest in the state of Minnesota, we need to invest in our people, and the size of the budget isn't too big. And I'm going to raise taxes to solve the budget deficit. We couldn't have the three bodies be further apart than I have seen in a long time. When we started session, there was a $6 billion budget deficit, and as I mentioned, very significant ideas on how to solve the budget deficit. At the end of session, the forecast showed that we had our budget deficit had been reduced by about $1 billion, but we still had a legislature and the governor who were as far apart as they were at the start of session on how to solve the budget deficit. Then we went into unprecedented shutdown. We had had a shutdown before under Governor Pawlenty in the split legislature. Back then it was a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, and then we had a Republican governor. But that shutdown it seemed long at the time, but now it was short-lived compared to the 20-day shutdown that we had. As things unfolded, the Attorney General at the beginning of the shutdown had petitioned the Ramsey County judge for what things that she believed the state was responsible to the state, what funding should continue. And as you know, the Attorney General had said the open and standing appropriation for education should continue. However, when the governor submitted his recommendations, he had a very narrow definition of what was considered critical or to protect the health, life, and safety of Minnesotans. And education funding was not part of that, which which, as I'm sure, you all felt very unsettled about. As that process evolved, a special master was appointed, and the special master, excuse me, sorry, it hasn't been that long ago, and my memory is already a little fuzzy. The Judge Gearin, I believe, ultimately, it's either Judge Gearin or the special master who ultimately ruled that the open and standing appropriation would continue, but that special ed funding would not. So then, and thanks to MSBA, they did present before the special master or the Judge Gearin about the open and standing appropriation. They again petitioned the court to have the special ed appropriation contingency fund, which ultimately that was a ruling that came in our favor. But as the shutdown progressed and more and more things were deemed critical, there's a lot of questions in many of our minds about what does that mean? Does that mean the shutdown is going to be much more protracted? And as at the end of June, the Republican legislature gave the governor offer, and ultimately that was the offer that was accepted. But for the first few weeks of the shutdown, they didn't even speak to each other. The governor then decided to go on a tour around the state, and from what I understand, it was ultimately that tour that made the governor continued to insist that he wanted some kind of revenue, and the legislature continued to insist the size of the budget is too big. We will not agree to new revenue. But they offered the legislature gave the governor was increased shift and then borrowing on future tobacco bonds on June 30th. Ultimately, the governor said, that's not an offer, you're not compromising. The governor continued to say, I've compromised. At the end of the session, I changed my tax plan, I reduced it, I was willing to agree to additional cuts, and you didn't continue to provide any additional compromise. And the legislature said, we compromised from the very beginning. We compromised to a larger budget than we wanted to. We wanted to have a $30 billion budget, and the budget we gave you was $34 billion. That was, they argued that was a huge compromise. So while they were arguing about who compromised enough or who didn't compromise enough, we started to go into government shutdown mode in the last week, especially the last week of session. We saw a lot of activities from the agencies about what they needed to do to prepare for shutdown. And on the last day before the shutdown, the Republicans gave their offer. And then Governor Dayton went on the tour, talked to a lot of people, citizens, and from what I heard and what I've been told, it was that tour that made the governor realize that he needed to accept an offer and that he was not going to win on his proposal to provide for additional tax increases, and that was a fight he could fight another day. The Republicans accepted the governor's acceptance of that offer. So the governor said, I will accept your borrowing on tobacco bonds, I will accept the additional K-12 shift, but I don't want any of the controversial policy on abortion, voter ID, the large controversial policy. And we had a lot of questions in our minds, at the lobbies for sure, well, what does that mean? Does that mean some of the other controversial policy that might not be very high profile is still out there? And we all really didn't get our answer until we saw the education bill on the last day of session. And we did not see the education bill until 1:30 in the morning on the last day of session. When the governor gave his offer on a Thursday, Friday, that evening, the Republican majority accepted the offer and they went into negotiation mode. And all of the negotiations were done behind closed doors, completely and totally behind closed doors. We were able to try to send emails to legislators to remind them about different things that we might have needed in the bill. We weren't able to. Well, I wasn't, maybe some other people were, but they didn't want to talk to us. They didn't want to call us back. They probably weren't reading their emails. So all of the negotiations went behind closed doors, and for the most part, the minority members were also not included in any of the negotiations. It was the Republican majority, the leadership, their committee chairs, the governor, and the various commissioners and appropriate agency staff. I'm going to let Tom talk a little bit about ultimately what was passed, but that process was very frustrating for us. It was very frustrating to not know until early in the morning what was in the bill. Ultimately, in the end, on the education bill, I think a lot of the most controversial provisions were, and I'm not talking about the shift. The shift is problematic for all of us. But some of the more controversial provisions, such as vouchers for the cities of the first class, that ultimately was not agreed to. The A through F rating system was not agreed to for schools. And then there's delinking of compensatory, that was not agreed to. There was integration. There was a compromise on integration. Originally, the legislature ended integration revenue and they put it into a new program. And now integration revenue will continue for a time certain with a task force to look at additional ways to provide revenue. And I'm going to let Tom talk about those details. So where does the MASBO platform stand? Through the years, MASBO has continued to have a greater presence at the Capitol. Every session, we always make sure the leadership in MASBO continue to meet with legislators. We're trying to continue. We worked really hard to build relationships with the new new committee chairs, and the governor's office. Obviously, MASBO has a great relationship with the department. And several of MASBO members were involved in the governor's task force on education funding. And maybe Tom might add a little bit about that if he has any feedback on what we might see from that. We didn't see any, we saw the summary this year, but we didn't see anything go into law. So MASBO has been really involved in all different fronts, through the administration and through the legislative process. We, when appropriate, provided testimony on various issues, mostly a lot on the shift and things like that. On the MASBO platform, we had a much more strategic approach this year. Usually the MASBO platform is much larger and much more encompassing on a number of different funding issues, but because of the budget size of the budget deficit and the change in the legislature, the MASBO platform was much more focused this year. And I think we were very successful on many of the provisions in the MASBO platform. Most notably, finally got passage of the streamlining of the health and safety program, repeal of the January 15th contract settlement deadline, and if you would have asked me in January if a Democratic governor would agree to that, I would have said no way. That's the one I'm probably the most surprised about. There was also a 2-year staff development freeze, temporary staff development freeze. There continues to be other things on the MASBO platform that we didn't succeed on this year, but that doesn't mean we can't go back next year and try to continue to move forward. But as each session goes by, I think MASBO, we've done a really good job of building relationships with your local legislators and the leadership at the state legislature. Do you have any questions for me about kind of the process or the big picture? Great. I am going to introduce Lisa Larson, who not many of you are familiar with Lisa Larson, but she is a research analyst and general counsel to the Education Policy Committee in the House. She has worked in the House since she was research assistant in 1983, and she's been in her role since 1984. She's a very valuable resource of the legislatures, and for the most part, Lisa focuses on education policy and education reform issues. And we have invited Lisa here today to talk briefly about some of the most significant policy reform provisions that are in the bill. There are 2 big significant reform changes in the bill. So thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Valerie. I don't know if you saw this, but there is a single-page list of some of the significant policy changes in the education finance bill. It's not every last one of them, but in my estimation, it's some of the more important ones. And what I'd like to do is talk about the top 4 on that list, and then if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Perhaps the most important has to do with the teacher and principal evaluation system that was put in place and the task forces that are charged